Yes, Mr. Tiga.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Honors, in the previous session, I described the bodies and forces established by Karadžić, which he later praised as having liberated and created the space, and indicated to you I wanted to speak next about what that space was and who it was liberated from. The territory claimed by Radovan Karadžić and the Bosnian Serb leadership was, in his own words, quote, huge, unquote, encompassing approximately 2/3 of Bosnia's territory. Recall, for instance, that Karadžić told Milosevic in that telephone call you heard, that you saw on screen, that the Bosnian government would not be able to assert control on 65% of its territory. Let me show you excerpts from a speech by Karadžić in November of 1991 to a plenary session of his many officials, at which many of his municipal officials were gathered, in which he underscored the extent of the territory and its significance to the Bosnian Serbs. Quote, "I am asking you to be energetic and strict, to get ready and establish authority in your municipality, in your territories, in municipalities, regions, local communities, and to prepare yourselves in regionalizing the municipalities. If you have a look at the map, we have a huge territory in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a huge territory." You'll see that at the bottom of your screen. And he also told the officials at that gathering, quote, "No Muslim foundation shall ever be laid in Serb areas and Serb villages. The first foundations that are laid will be blown up, and all foundations that are laid will be blown up. The world will understand when we tell them that we will not allow the demographic picture to change either naturally or artificially. No way. Our territories are ours. You must not sell land to Muslims. You must not, because this is a fight to the finish, a battle for living space," unquote. Karadžić justified the claim that Bosnian Serbs were entitled to 2/3 of Bosnia's territory in a number of ways, including the genocide of World War II, land ownership, the places where a majority of Serbs had voted in a plebiscite to remain in Yugoslavia, the autonomous regions. But however numerous and varied the rationales offered, the territory encompassed vast portions of Bosnia, territory on which hundreds of thousands of Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats lived. Indeed, many municipalities in which they were the majority. As you will observe from another look at the demographic map, and see the extent of the green areas involved. And the Muslims and Croats who lived on these territories, Your Honors, Karadžić repeatedly made clear, were enemies with whom the Serbs could not live. Serbs and Muslims, he said, were like dogs and cats, losing their natural characteristics after being in the, quote, same box. And after noting that Serbs had been forcefully held in Bosnia and Herzegovina with what he called their, quote, centuries-old foes, he said, "It all reminds me of the experiment in which a dog and cat are held together in a box together against their will, or a bad marriage maintained by all sorts of forceful means. It transpired that a dog and a cat can remain in the box together only under one condition, namely that they lose their natural characteristics and cease being a dog and cat. We will remember that we could not be Serbs and live in such a box." Or he said, "Non-Serbs and Serbs were like incompatible plants that cannot survive side by side. In the plant world," he said, "there are plants which cannot grow side by side. They have to be separated to flourish," unquote. Or they were like oil and water. Muslims were, quote, unquote, Turks, historical and implacable enemies. As he said in January of 1994, quote, "This is the kind of war where you cannot lose the war now and fight again in 10 years. Nobody can stay under Turks' rule. Nobody must stay under Turks' rule," unquote. Similarly, Croats were Ustasha, reincarnations of the enemies of World War II. Muslims, he said, would demographically overwhelm the Serbs through a birth rate that the Serbs could not match. Quote, "We cannot control the Muslims in such a unitary state. We know very well what the fundamentalism is, and that we cannot live together. There's no tolerance. They quadruple through the birth rate, and we Serbs are not up to that," unquote. And he said Muslims were Islamic fundamentalists intent on establishing an Islamic state, explaining, for example, that their 5 centuries-long experience with Islam meant that Serbs, quote, "knew how to recognize ancient danger posed by the toxic, all-destructive Islamic octopus," unquote. And perhaps the ugliest canard of all, since it projected onto the victims the justification for their destruction, Muslims and Croats threatened Bosnian Serbs with genocide, wanted to kill them and eradicate them. Quote, this is Dr. Karadžić, "The wars of 1914, 1941, and 1991 were and remain above all wars for the extermination of the Orthodox population," unquote. Karadžić's vilification of the Bosnian Muslims and Croats was made to a receptive audience. The level of Serb nationalism and anti-Muslim and Croat sentiment was extreme. You will see and hear many anti-Muslim and anti-Croat sentiments expressed and slurs expressed from the republic level down to the municipal level. And I'll just cite here 2 examples. This is Radoslav Brjanin, again, the president of the crisis staff in the autonomous region of Krajina, the man who called Karadžić and got the response, "I'm not your nanny." That was an area that encompassed most of northwestern Bosnia. This is Brjanin talking at a 1994 rally with Karadžić, Krajišnik, Plavšić, and other Bosnian Serb leaders present, attended by thousands and thousands of people. Quote, "Those leftist forces which are offering us coexistence again must know that it is the obligation of Serbs over the next 100 years to wipe their feet from the foul non-Christians who have befouled this soil of ours," unquote. And he continued, "And I suggest that we put up a barbed wire and say that never again will our enemies spread throughout Krajina and attack us for the 4th or 5th time in this century." And one more example from the local level, and you'll see many such examples, but perhaps this from the Sanski Most SDS publication will suffice. Quote, "Do you know what our bloodthirsty enemies have been scheming for us? What they had in mind was to gouge out our eyes and carve us up, hack our bodies to pieces, rape women and girls in front of their dearest, to circumcise, to destroy our religion, to crush us, just because we happen to be Serbs. Don't think that anybody's family would have been spared. They had monsters ready and committed to raping Serbian women, and they had developed a system of killing each and every Serb," unquote. The bottom line, Your Honors, as Karadžić told the Bosnian Serb Assembly deputies and others in 1992, shortly before the takeovers commenced, was that Serbs couldn't live with Muslims and must separate from them. Quote, "Muslims cannot live with others, and we must be clear on that," They couldn't live with the Hindu, who are as peaceful as sheep. That's the Indian religion. They are a peaceful people, and yet they couldn't live with them. They couldn't live with a Greek on Cyprus. They couldn't live in the Lebanon with Arabs of the same blood, same language, but of a different faith. There can be no discussion here. They will overwhelm you with their birth rate and their tricks. We cannot allow that to happen, unquote. And after the Muslims had been forcibly removed, Karadžić continued to emphasize the importance of ethnically pure territory. This is what he told the Assembly at the beginning of 1994 about the possibility of having to give up some of the territory they conquered, which by that time was 70% of Bosnia. Quote, "We can consider ourselves as winners after occupying this land, since the land is 100% Serbian now. Therefore, even if we come down to 50%, we should be more than happy and satisfied. It is Dušan's empire," unquote. In short, Your Honors, even if they retain only 50% of the territory, they should be pleased, because that territory is 100% Serbian, as it was in Tsar Dušan's time before the Muslims ever arrived. And as he continued to explain, citing well-known examples of ethnically pure territories like Foča and Doboj, quote, "2 years ago, we were a group in Bosnia and Herzegovina that had some rights, and now we are the state, and what we hold is 100% ours." As a deputy reminded the Bosnian Serb Assembly in 1993, after much of the conquering and cleansing had taken place, they should be happy with what had been accomplished and not overly concerned that Serbs would have to leave areas that peace plans proposed allocating to the Bosnian government. Quote, "Gentlemen, there is no Serbian state in Bosnian Pot without gradual depopulation and relocating. If we want ethnically pure state, and we do, don't we? If we all know and emphasize that we cannot live with them, then we have to realize that these draft maps are offering exactly that, and there has to be relocation," unquote. Your Honors, I've discussed the structures and bodies that were ready for forcible separation by the end of March 1992, but let me pause a moment before discussing the takeovers to mention negotiations. During the same period as the establishment of those structures and bodies, Karadžić and his compatriots were also negotiating with Bosnian Serb political leaders in an effort to get an agreement on what the Bosnian Serbs wanted, or at least something sufficiently close to allow them over time to realize their ultimate goals and unify with Serbia and the Croatian Serbs. Now, you are likely to hear a great deal from the accused during the course of the trial about negotiations, and particularly the Kudalero negotiations. He already testified in the Krajišnik appeal that the European community, quote, promised, unquote, the Serbs a republic, and has suggested, as a result, that it was the Muslims who were responsible for the crimes that took place because they backed out of the Kudalero agreement. Now, that is false and misleading on a number of levels. No promises were made by the European community, which was acting only as a mediator. The closest the negotiations came to a final agreement was an agreement in principle to negotiate about constituent units based on ethnicity as well as other factors. And even that limited agreement was not signed. Indeed, it was Karadžić who assured the Assembly that nothing had been signed and would not be signed until the Bosnian Serbs got exactly what they wanted. But beyond the twisting of the facts, even if an agreement had been completed, this case is not about whether Karadžić could have been deterred by a settlement before he implemented forcible separation. It's no defense to complain that the victims failed to capitulate before force was required to get what he wanted. In any event, Karadžić always led the Serbs on a two-track approach. Negotiations on the one hand, and on the other, the willingness and ability to use force to get what he wanted if negotiations didn't work. And what he couldn't get in negotiations, he turned his military to conquer, and they did. This is Mladić in 1995 describing the basic objectives of all the mentioned operations, which was to break and destroy the enemy forces and, quote, thus impose by the force of arms the final settlement of the war on the enemy and place the international community in a position of having to recognize the actual situation in the field and end the war, unquote. And over the course of the conflict, Karadžić and the Bosnian Serb leadership would emphasize and rely in negotiations upon the factual situation they had created through cleansing. As Karadžić said, quote, we have created new realities. Speaking in narrow terms, Zvornik used to be 60-40 to the advantage of the Muslims. But the Serbs from Zenica came, they occupied Kozluk, the Muslims left for Europe and I do not know where else. And then those gentlemen told us, speaking about the negotiators, who gives you a right to ask for Zvornik? And then Karadžić continues as if answering the negotiators, we request Zvornik based on the right which comes out of a new reality. This war had created the new reality, unquote. And he would insist it would take a new war, another war, to undo what he had accomplished by force. Now, to recap, Your Honors, by late March 1992, the political structures were ready, the police was ready, and the SDS armed units were ready, again backed by the JNA, to liberate the space. On March 24th, 1992, with Bosnian independence just 2 weeks away, Karadžić explained to the Assembly that the numbers of police were sufficient and very soon they could form what they wanted. Quote, all the Serbian municipalities, both the old ones and the newly established ones, would literally assume control of the entire territory of the municipality concerned. He explained that within days, quote, there will be a single method used and you will be able to apply it in the municipalities you represent, including both things that must be done as well as how to do them, how to separate the police force, take the resources that belong to the Serbian people, and take command, unquote. And indeed, they were ready. The gap in military capacity between the Serbian-aided Bosnian Serbs and the Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats was reflected in takeover after takeover by Bosnian Serb forces. You'll see repeated references in the evidence to the universal awareness of the huge gap in weaponry and military capacity that existed at the commencement of the takeovers and for a long time thereafter. As one of the deputies said in January 1993 about the Muslims at the beginning of the war, quote, they weren't trained, they weren't accustomed to war, and they didn't have any weapons, unquote. Instead, it was the Serbs, he explained, who were the absolute masters in war. And this was echoed by a 1993 analysis of combat readiness and activities of the Army of Republika Srpska, a strictly confidential and military secret document prepared by the VRS, which said, quote, since the Muslims did not have any weapons, didn't have enough weapons or support equipment, no significant support of infantry units in action was necessary, especially not by longer range or higher caliber ordnance. Your Honors, I referred a moment ago to Karadžić's explanation on the 24th of March 1992 to those gathered at the Bosnian Serb Assembly that within days they could take command. Let me now turn to the commencement of the takeovers of municipalities by Bosnian Serb forces. Back in January 1992, Karadžić, at that moment furious at Izetbegović for talking openly of a sovereign and independent Bosnia, told Krajišnik in an intercepted telephone conversation, quote, "Fuck him. We will release our tigers and let them do their job," unquote. And at the end of March 1992, with Bosnian independence imminent, it was time. Within the few days Karadžić referred to, the takeovers began, and one municipality after another fell under mono-ethnic control, with the same combined forces previously relied upon in Croatia. First in Bijeljina, under the supervision of the Serb crisis staff. As you can see that, started removing the barricades under the supervision of the, as it refers to there, Your Honors, refers to the Serbian Volunteer Guard, working under the supervision of the Bijeljina crisis staff. That volunteer guard is Arkan, a notorious paramilitary leader who assisted in Bijeljina and would then move on to other municipalities. Arkan was in contact with the Bosnian Serb leadership, in particular with Biljana Plavšić, who monitored his advance to Zvornik and invited him to assist in Sarajevo. Elsewhere, Karadžić's forces took over municipalities with the help of the JNA. In Vlasenica, for example, quote, "On 20 April 1992, the forces of the Yugoslav Army and the formed unit coordinated by the SDS crisis staff liberated the town of Vlasenica," unquote. In Sarajevo, Karadžić and his close associates directly and personally oversaw the seizure of power and forcible ethnic separation. Among others, he worked closely with local SDS political and military leaders such as Jovan Tintor, who was mentioned previously, and Nedeljko Prstojević. As Prstojević later told the Assembly, when Karadžić, quote, "visited us in Ilija and encouraged us, the Serbs from Sarajevo retained control over the territory and even extended their territory in some areas, driving the Muslims out of the territories where they had actually been majority," unquote. You'll see a number of intercepted telephone calls involving Prstojević, including an intercept in which he directs that men are to be taken to prison, women sent to the Muslim-held area, and, quote, "tell them, those who convert to Orthodox religion on the spot, they can stay, women and children," unquote. Now, during this period, during the first 6 weeks following the commencement of takeovers, until the establishment of a formal collective presidency, Karadžić headed the National Security Council. You saw that in the chart before, and that was the body that preceded the collective presidency. That was composed of Karadžić's closest associates, including Krajišnik, Koljević, Plavšić, Stanisić, and Minister of Defense Bogdan Subotić. As Karadžić said in 1993, quote, "While we still did not have a state, we had a Council for National Security consisted of our most important people," unquote. The National Security Council made decisions on many topics of importance during that time, which were subsequently formalized through the de jure stamp of Koljević and Plavšić as acting presidents at that time, or through the government and its ministries. For example, Karadžić signed the decision to raise the territorial defense, and it was Karadžić who was designated to coordinate the command of the TO forces as well as political action. As mentioned earlier, Karadžić would later praise the efforts of the armed forces of the SDS and the police in liberating and creating the space in the first 5 or 6 weeks after the takeovers began. And indeed, by May 12, 1992, when the Assembly met for the first time since the takeovers began, many municipalities had indeed been taken over. But on May 12, 1992, when the Assembly met in Banja Luka, the Bosnian Serb forces would become even stronger. They established their army. In the weeks preceding that Assembly session, Karadžić had arranged with Milosevic and other Yugoslav officials to ensure the establishment of the army through the transformation of the JNA, the Yugoslav National Army, which formally withdrew from Bosnia but left behind many tens of thousands of soldiers and officers over whom the Bosnian Serb leadership took control, could take command, and also a wealth of arms. And during the course of the conflict, Milosevic and the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia would continue to support the Bosnian Serbs with weaponry, logistical support, and personnel, creating secret personnel centers through which to fund the officers and other personnel with salaries and benefits. Now, for commander of the main staff of the new Bosnian Serb Army, Karadžić selected Ratko Mladić, who had led cleansing efforts in Croatia. As Karadžić reminisced to the Assembly in 1995, quote, "Gentlemen, we got the officers we asked for. I asked for Mladić. General Ninković, then a colonel, and General Perisic had visited me before that, and I had noticed Mladic's blunt statements in the newspapers. He was already in Knin then. I took an interest in him, and together with Mr. Krajišnik, I went to General Kukajnic's office and listened to him issuing orders and commanding around Kupres and Knin. We spent countless nights in the office of General Kukajnic at that time." But what was it that the army was to do? And it was Karadžić who explained that as well on the 12th of May, announcing and explaining the strategic objectives as part of his political and military situation to be adopted by the Assembly, goals which would define the tasks of the VRS during the course of the war. These goals formalized objectives that Karadžić's forces had already been pursuing. And as noted in the Combat Readiness Report, that 1993 review of events in 1992 and early 93, these goals were put before the VRS as the guideline upon which they planned the actual operations. Quote, "The strategic objectives of our war, which were promptly defined and set before the main staff of the Army of Republika Srpska, the commands and units, served as a general guideline upon which we planned the actual operations and concerted battles," unquote. As Mladić himself said, quote, "The tasks of the Army in this war stem from the known 6 strategic objectives adopted by our Assembly," unquote. Now, at that Assembly, the May 12th Assembly, Karadžić explained that the first strategic goal was separation. Quote, "The first such goal is separation from the other two national communities, separation of states, separation from those who are our enemies and have used every opportunity, especially in this century, to attack us, and who would continue with such practices if we were to stay together in the same state." And that same state he's talking about, of course, is Bosnia, and the enemies he's talking about are the Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats. And the separation to which he refers would be achieved by ethnic cleansing. Now, this strategic goal, the first strategic goal, was, as Krajišnik said at that Assembly, the most important goal. And he said that the rest were just subsets of that goal. In other words, they were directed to where that separation would be focused. The second strategic goal was the creation of a corridor in the Posavina area that would link not only the Bosnian Serb claimed territory within that area to each other, but also to the Croatian Serbs to the west and to Serbia in the east. The third strategic goal was a corridor in the Drina Valley to eliminate the Drina as a border. And it's seen by that circle. The fourth strategic goal was a border on the Una River and on the Neretva River. The Una to the northwest, the Neretva to the southeast. The fifth strategic goal was the division of Sarajevo. One part to the Muslims, one part to the Serbs. And the sixth strategic goal was access to the sea. And by achieving these 6 strategic goals, Karadžić told the Assembly on the 12th of May, the Serbs will, quote, finally finish the job of the freedom struggle of the Serbian people, unquote, and finally shed the, quote, Serbian illusion of brotherhood and unity, especially one which transcends the boundaries of religion, unquote. Now, Mladić, who was named as commander of the main staff at that session, was also present, and he also spoke about the goals after Karadžić had announced them. And he advised those gathered at the Assembly not to be overambitious. Quote, please, let us not set before ourselves goals that will bring us down. Let us set before ourselves goals that we can achieve. And that was in part, he said, because the international community might not let them keep everything they conquered, and also in part because cleansing can be difficult. Quote, people and peoples are not pawns, nor are they keys in one's pocket that can be shifted from here to there. It is something easily said, but difficult to achieve, unquote. And he reminded the delegates there that the nature of the goals required secrecy. Quote, and please, let us not only put our minds into what we are doing, but let us also think thoroughly about it, and let us be cautious about when to keep mum. No, the thing that we are doing needs to be guarded as our deepest secret, unquote. Now, at that same session on May 12, 1992, Karadžić was elected to the 3-person collective presidency. That was a perfunctory procedure that required no debate or discussion. He was then selected as president of the presidency and designated as the member of the presidency in charge of military affairs. By December of the same year, he became sole president and remained so for the duration of the conflict. In either capacity, indeed in any of his capacities, as you saw from some of the earlier intercepts, whether as president of the presidency in charge of military affairs or as sole president, he was the de jure and de facto military leader, the supreme commander. As a member of the main staff of the then recently formed Bosnian Serb Army, explained in September 1992 at the Bosnian Serb Assembly, quote, the basic elements are, there is the supreme command of the army and there is the President of the Republic as the supreme commander. In our situation, this will be the president, which was the case at that time. All the elements of defense and the army are subordinated to this institution. We in the army are following this and are trying to fully observe it. There was no significant act that passed without this in mind. Therefore, this chain of command follows this line. The supreme commander, that is the President of the Republic, the General Staff in the Federal Army, i.e. the main staff in our case. And perhaps it's useful also to hear it from Mladić, speaking in 1993 and speaking to Karadžić. Quote, no officer conducted a task without your approval in the Army of Republika Srpska. Mr. President, you had a full support of both the Army and military intelligence service, unquote. And as Mladić also said to Karadžić in 1993, referring both to the strategic objectives and to Karadžić's commanding position, quote, Mr. President, as far as I remember, during the session held on 12 May last year, this assembly has given us a task and you have appointed me as the commander of the main headquarters. It is not correct that I have not obeyed your every order. But again, let's hear it from Karadžić himself, talking about the period after he became the sole president and established a supreme command to assist him, which consisted of various political and military leaders. Quote, I am in charge, in particular of the Army. I report to you and to the people. Commanders report to me, the commander of the main staff and commanders of corps and brigades. The approval was given. I established a supreme command so that I do not make decisions by myself. I did not establish it to use it as a cover. I am the one who signs, who decides, and I will be responsible for each decision. Now, Karadžić was not a tactical commander and didn't have military experience, and his relationship with Mladić and the VRS had its frictions and tensions, including confrontational episodes in '93, and particularly in 1995, when Karadžić sought to shift Mladić's position in the wake of the loss of the Croatian Krajina in 1995. But throughout, neither Karadžić's ultimate authority nor his joint commitment with Mladić to the fundamental objectives of the criminal enterprises were altered. And Karadžić himself emphasized that these frictions did not alter the chain of command and indeed were healthy and expected. Quote, "As Commander-in-Chief, I am highly respected by all officers and soldiers. I like it when they argue with me about solutions because this helps me reach good decisions. And after I have passed a decision, they carry it out in a brilliant way." And with Karadžić in command, the VRS, in combination with the MUP war units, began to disseminate and implement the objectives. The strategic objectives were communicated to officers, conscripts, and various municipal leaders. For example, 2 days after Karadžić announced the strategic objectives on the 12th of May, Army leaders met with municipality presidents in the Ark region in northwestern Bosnia. And at that meeting, the participants were informed of the conclusions of the 12 May session, which was held in Banja Luka. Quote, "The strategic goals formulated at the meeting in Banja Luka were presented," and, quote, "The conclusions of the meeting in Banja Luka are to be implemented and will also be forwarded to the commands of units and municipalities," unquote. In a similar manner, General Momir Talić, who was then commander of the 1st Krajina Corps in the Ark region, issued an implementation order to all brigades and divisions to, among other things, quote, "explain to conscripts as they arrive the goals of our struggle," unquote. Now, these goals were described in a document prepared by Talić's assistant commander, a document to be sent to all Corps units. It explained that the Serbian people were exposed to genocide and, quote, "must struggle for complete separation from the Muslim and Croatian peoples and form their own state," unquote. Separation from the Bosnian Muslims and Croats, the first and most important strategic goal from which all the other goals sprang and which all the other goals were subsets of. And the VRS began almost immediately to implement the objectives. Now, as mentioned, Your Honors, the second strategic goal enunciated by Karadžić was a corridor between Semberia and Krajina, quote, and that's this area, as you see depicted on the map. This area, the Posavina-era corridor between the western part of Bosnia and the eastern part, where the Croatian Serbs are in the west and Serbia in the east. Karadžić said about the second strategic goal, "This is of the utmost importance, strategic importance for the Serbian people, because it integrates the Serbian lands, not only of Serbian Bosnia and Herzegovina, but Serbian Bosnia and Herzegovina with Serbia, and the Serbian Krajina with Serbian Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia." So that is a very important strategic goal which we have to achieve, because there will be no Krajina, Bosnian Krajina, Serbian Krajina, or alliance of Serbian states if we do not secure that corridor. Now, Talić, who was the head of the 1st Krajina Corps which operated in that region, and who was also, along with Mladic, another veteran of the Croatian cleansing campaign whose collaboration with Karadžić you'll see in intercepts. Talić was called upon, was tasked with the responsibility of establishing the corridor, the Posavina corridor, along with others. And he was successful in doing so. By the 24th of July, 1992, he was able to provide this directive to all tactical groups of the 1st Krajina Corps. Quote, "We have liberated the territories we consider our own and created conditions for the political and military leadership of the Serbian Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina to conduct all activities and negotiations on the future constitutional system of Bosnia and Herzegovina from the position of the stronger side in these parts." And he continued, "We have established corridors in eastern Bosnia and Bosnia-Posavina, thus fulfilling the centuries-old aspirations to connect the Serbian people in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Serbian Republic of Krajina with the parent country, Serbia." Serbian Republic of Krajina was the Croatian Serb Republic. Indeed, by the 1st of July, 1992, Mladic was able to send this tribute to the 1st Krajina Corps and others for their successes. Quote, indicates he'd like to pay tribute and express his gratitude. And then he continues, "For successfully organized and implemented operation for breakthrough, expansion, and cleansing of corridor in Bosanska Posavina between eastern and western Bosnia, as well as excogitation and organized joint action and coordination of combat units and activities. The units of this corps in this territory also showed that only unified combat against the enemy of Serbianhood in Bosnia and Herzegovina will bring us to realization of military and political goals." The fulfillment of strategic objective number 2 through Operation Corridor, as it was called, and the concomitant pursuit of strategic objective number 1, separation, was achieved in a lightning campaign against an overwhelmed Muslim and Croat population in the targeted areas. Those operations were characterized by initial shelling of villages, followed by attacks of infantry, generally with little or insignificant resistance. Control over the area was generally established quickly, followed by the rounding up of the Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats and their removal to detention facilities and camps. Villages were laid to waste during the shelling and afterwards. And I'd like to direct your attention to just a few documents which illustrate the nature of this campaign. The first is a weekly update from the Security Services Center, that is the regional headquarters of the police in western Bosnia, located in Banja Luka. And it describes what happened following a confrontation at a checkpoint during which 2 Serb soldiers in the car were stopped and were killed, but the alleged perpetrators were not immediately handed over to the military command. Quote, "The Army carried out an artillery attack on the village of Hamburin and mopped up the area." That same report goes on to discuss another alleged provocation in another area, that's Kozarac. Quote, "The Army engaged in a mopping up operation. Several hundred inhabitants of these villages were killed or wounded," unquote. Now, 2 quick points about terminology. The translation, mopping up, is from the BCS word čisćenje, or a variation of that word. Now, this word can be interpreted to mean in English either cleanse or mop up. A mop-up operation is conventionally an operation or a reference to an effort after a battle to ferret out the last remaining enemy forces, or it can refer to a cleansing operation directed against civilians. And it'll be up to the court to decide on the basis of the evidence in the context of any particular use of that term what it refers to and what kind of actions it involves. The two passages I just referred the court to, referring to the Češćenja of Hambarin and Kozarac in the Prijedor municipality, refer to two unmistakable and brutal acts of ethnic cleansing against overwhelmed civilian populations, as you'll be able to see from the evidence. Another document illustrating the nature of the operations to fulfill Strategic Objective 2, and of course Strategic Objective 1, the objective from which it sprang, is this one from General Talich to the main staff of the Army on the 14th of June, 1992. Quote, "The most difficult situation concerns the Muslim and Croat refugees in the area of Autonomous Region Krajina, their security and the provision of food. The attempt to expel them to central Bosnia failed because of transportation difficulties and their resistance to leaving the places." Or this one, again from Talich to the main staff, quote, "In the area of Derventa, there continues to be occasional artillery fire, while because Muslim extremists have failed to hand in their weapons, the Muslim population of the area of Lishnia village has been expelled." Other documents that you'll see, Your Honors, refer to the massive destruction, literally, quote, "the massive destruction of Muslim towns," refer to public statements by SDS leaders advocating expelling all Bosnian Muslims and Croats, refer to Talich's view that municipal and regional leaders should, quote, "work harder," unquote, at the departure of the Bosnian Muslim and Bosnian Croat population. And of course, you'll have the benefit of the evidence from eyewitnesses to those campaigns at that time. Let me turn to Strategic Objective 3 and its implementation. Again, this is Strategic Objective 3 and the area encompassed by it. And that's the area in eastern Bosnia. As Karadžić explained on the 12th of May, quote, "The third strategic goal is to establish a corridor in the Drina Valley, that is, elimination of the Drina as a border between two worlds. We are on both sides of the Drina, and our strategic interest and our living space are there," unquote. And he continued, "As much as it is strategically useful for us in a positive way, it helps us by damaging the interests of our enemy in establishing a corridor which would connect them to the Muslim International and render this area permanently unstable." That connection to Muslim International he referred to is also sometimes referred to by Karadžić and others as the, quote, "green transversal," unquote. And what it refers to is the blocking of any access by Muslims from Serbia into Bosnia and what was then the conquered Bosnian Serb territory. And you can see from the green area on the east part of Bosnia, and I'd ask you to, that circle indicates Strategic Objective number 3. I'm referring to number 2, rather. I'm referring to Strategic Objective number 3, the elimination of the Drina as a border on the east part of Bosnia. And you can see the green representing Muslim municipalities. So the attempt was to make sure that Bosnian Serb living space in that area was secured and that there was no possibility of access by Muslims coming from Serbia. Now, as noted in the Combat Readiness Report, the 1993 VRS strictly confidential analysis of events in 1992, despite the successes of the SDS military units and police in the first 5 or 6 weeks of the war, since the takeovers began, they had, quote, "failed to achieve the main strategic objectives of the armed struggle of the Serbian people in former Bosnia and Herzegovina, including opening up and securing a corridor." That is, they failed to open up and secure corridors through the Sava River Valley, Posavina, between the Krajina and the Fraj, or a corridor which would link Herzegovina with the Fry via the Drina River Valley. Now, as I will discuss later, the attempt to fully realize strategic objective number 3 extended on past 1992 and into 1995 with the attack on Srebrenica. But in 1992, with the Bosnian Serbs' overwhelming military superiority, much of the objective was indeed realized, as municipality after municipality in eastern Bosnia was cleansed by Karadžić's forces. Now, strategic objective number 3 and the corridor in eastern Bosnia began to be implemented quickly. Here's an order by Mladić on the 17th of June 1992, referring to the importance of the operations, quote, in order to have full control over the area of Birac and to secure the corridor between Romania and Semberia and to maintain a link with Serbia. Romania is the area just to the east of Sarajevo. Semberia is up north, and the Birac region is in the area of Zvornik, Vlasenica, Bratunac, and Srebrenica. And again, Your Honors, just a couple of documents to illustrate the nature of the campaign to implement strategic objective number 3. Here's one from the 28th of May, 1992, issued by the commander of the Birac Brigade, as I said, in the area around Zvornik, Bratunac, and Vlasenica, in the northern part of the Drina River area. Quote, the moving out of the Muslim population must be organized and coordinated with the municipalities through which the moving out is carried out. Only women and children can move out, while men fit for military service are to be placed in camps for exchange. Unquote. On the 7th, similarly, on the 7th of June, the commander of the Eastern Bosnia Corps issued an order which was sent to all subordinated units concerning coordinated operations in northern and eastern Bosnia between the Eastern Bosnia Corps and the 1st Krajina Corps, and that order contains no fewer than 9 references to čišćenje or čistite, cleansing or mopping up. It prohibits the maltreatment of the civilian population, but anticipates, consistent with that Andrich order, that is the Birac Brigade order you just saw, the arrest of civilians. And again, you will have the benefit of all the evidence to determine the meaning of čišćenje in the context of the order to which I just referred, as you review the evidence of roundup in towns, towns attacked and burned, up and down the length of the corridor. And you will also consider, Your Honors, the contemporaneous evidence of cleansing known to the Bosnian Serb leadership. In late July 1992, for example, Rajko Dukic, one of the most powerful political leaders in the Birac region, and Karadžić's close crony, and you'll see that in intercepts. Dukic was the president of the SDS Executive Board, noted with satisfaction to Karadžić, Krajišnik, and others at the assembly session, quote, there is Birac, which is 100 to 108 kilometers away and has 120,000 Muslims. Well, that is how many there were, but I hope that has at least been halved. And this was the same assembly session, I should quickly add, Your Honors, at which the point was made that Serbs were appointed to be the Muslims' executioners. Now, that desire for the reduction of the Muslim presence in eastern Bosnia was almost fully realized during 1992, with some exceptions. The Muslim population was reduced to a negligible percentage in eastern Bosnia. And you saw from the maps how significant that presence was before the cleansing began. And Serb officials took undisguised satisfaction in the ethnic purification of those territories. Let me just point the court to some examples from Foča. The first are 2 quotes from Petko Čančar, an important leader from Foča who was close to Karadžić and Krajišnik and occupied a number of important republic-level positions, including advisor to the presidency. And this is Čančar speaking about Foča in 1993. Quote, there is only one people living on the territory of Foča, and there is only one religion practiced there. That people is prepared to fight and to defend, and God knows that. And as he noted on another occasion, again speaking about Foča, quote, there currently is not a single Muslim in the biggest municipality in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Not a single Muslim. This ethnic purification of a previously Muslim majority municipality was praised by the Bosnian Serb leadership. I want to direct your attention to the words of Momčilo Krajišnik addressing a crowd in the renamed Foča, now called Srbinja, the name adopted for a Muslim-free Foča, on the anniversary of its quote-unquote liberation. Dear people of Srbinja, it is a great pleasure to be among you after 2.5 years. Today, you are not as you were before. Now I see a true Serbian town, and you proudly bear your Serbian name. Your Honors, this satisfaction in ethnically pure territory was balanced against the pressures of the international community and the resulting interest in retaining some minimal Muslim or Croatian presence for public relations purposes. In August 1992, for example, Karadžić reminded Assembly delegates, the deputies, that some percentage of non-Serbs was politically useful, asserting that the Bosnian government used this as a ploy. Quote, as far as other nations are concerned, we have to have a percentage, proportion participating in the municipal authorities. We have to be responsible as we are creating a state. I can't elaborate on this longer, but I know what I'm saying. Believe me, Alija pays fortune, and refers to Alija Izetbegović, to any Serb willing to stay and work on his territory, unquote. But whether the targeted percentage of Muslims and Croats who were allowed to remain would be 5%, as publicly advocated by Brjanin, or the territory was to be completely pure, as Čančar took pleasure in and as advocated by others, the territory had to be sufficiently free of Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats to render it permanently and uncontestably Serb. As Karadžić would explain in a closed session of the Assembly in 1995, quote, the Drina should be clean. And he candidly acknowledged at that moment how it happened. Quote, to tell the truth, there are towns that we've grabbed for ourselves and there were only 30% of us. I can name as many of those as you want, but we cannot give up the towns where we made up 70%. Don't let this get around, but remember how many of us there were in Bratunac, how many in Srebrenica, how many in Visegrad, how many in Rogatica, how many in Vlasenica, in Zvornik, etc. Due to strategic importance, they had to become ours, and no one is practically questioning it anymore. And that strategic importance was reflected in strategic objective number 3. Now, Your Honors, I'll address the focus and implementation of one more strategic objective, and that's number 4. Strategic objective number 4, as mentioned, was the establishment of a border on the Una and the Neretva rivers. And you can see that in this slide. Immediately after Karadžić announced the objectives, at that same session, the delegate from a municipality located on the Una, at the point where that arrow was shown, stood up, and that's the area there, stood up to express satisfaction in what had been accomplished toward the realization of strategic objective number 4 by that time. And this was a municipality where Serbs represented 14,500 people and Muslims were 47,000. And he said, quote, on the right bank of the Una River, there are no more Muslims than the Serbian municipality of Bosanska Krupa. All the enclaves that were there, and he named them, we have evacuated them. so that there will be none there for the duration of war operations. Will they have a place to return to? I think it is unlikely after our president told us the happy news that the right bank of the Una is the border. And within 2 weeks of that, quote, happy news, the war presidency of that municipality in Bosanska Krupa made this proposal to the Army Brigade in that area: to carry out all military preparations concerning the cleansing of the left bank of the Una River, including the right bank of the Una in the action in the area above Bosanska Otoka. In course of preparations and cleansing of the left bank of the Una, destroy and pull down as many residential and other buildings as possible. And the war presidency also provided the reasons for that proposal. And reason number one, the political decision designating that the border of the Serbian municipality, the autonomous region of Banja Luka, the Serbian Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the Serbian state should be on the Una River up to Bosanska Otoka. That is strategic objective number 4. As the VRS and MOOP units implemented those objectives, local municipality leaders, those who were so lavishly praised by Karadžić for their roles in liberating the space, also frequently continued to play their role in the implementation of separation. The removal of non-Serbs from the claimed territories did not result solely from the direct application of military force, but also from the cumulative effects of persecution, pressure, intimidation, and marginalization of Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats. The voices of the victims that I referred to earlier reveal the increasing hopelessness and terror of the Bosnian Muslims and Croats as they realized that continuing life in the municipalities claimed and taken over by the Bosnian Serb forces was impossible. And in addition to witnesses, you'll see that situation reflected in documents. I'd like you to look for a moment, if you will, at this resolution adopted in Chelinac, which was the home municipality of Radislav Brežanin. It's an extreme version of a process that existed in some measure in all municipalities. Until further notice, the citizens mentioned in Article 1 are forbidden to be on the streets from 4 o'clock in the afternoon till the morning hours, forbidden to remain on the streets or restaurants or public places, forbidden to swim in the rivers or to hunt or to fish, forbidden to travel without permission, forbidden to use an automobile, forbidden to gather in groups of more than 3 men, and so on. Municipal leaders as well as regional leaders also assisted with logistical support to the VRS, that is the Bosnian Serb Army, collaborated with local police officials, many of whom were on crisis staffs in any event, collaborated with them in expulsions by train or by bus, and as I will discuss in a moment, worked closely with the MOOP and sometimes the VRS on the widespread camp system. And now I'd like to turn to those camps and detention facilities. Virtually every municipality had at least one significant camp or detention facility, and many had several, depending upon the size of the Bosnian Muslim and Bosnian Croat population in that municipality. These facilities were typically run by the police, as in the case of some of the most notorious camps, including Omarska and Karaturm and Prijedor, and sometimes guarded on the outside by the VRS. Muslims and Croats were sometimes brought in individually or in small groups, and sometimes via wholesale roundups of villages. Now, there were also camps established by the Army. For example, the Manjača camp in Banja Luka, or the Karadžić camp in Bijeljina. These camps were fed very often with influxes of prisoners from the camps in surrounding municipalities and sometimes quite distant municipalities. They were degrading and typically brutal places, situated in such locations as old mines, abandoned factories, old concrete buildings, and the like. In the best of circumstances, detainees existed in dehumanizing conditions. And I'd like to show you some of those conditions with this video.
Uvjeti u kojima je zatočeno 3.500 zarobljenika nisu dostojni ni životinja, a kamoli ljudi. Zatvorenici pričaju kako je u logoru Omarska bilo još tragičnije.
It was a shed which in better days might have housed animals, now home to more than 600 men. Here the prisoners live, eat and sleep 24 hours a day. Most of these men just arrived 3 days ago from the camp of the master, their faces still haunted by memories they did not dare relate in the presence of their guards. Conditions here, they token, things were much better than the place they'd just come from.
The leadership is under tremendous pressure to allow outsiders access to these camps. The proposed UN resolution would authorize any means necessary to implement that access, as well as guarantee the supply of humanitarian aid. Prisoners we ask maintain they are civilians, not soldiers. Those we saw are crammed into cattle sheds where they spend all day and all night, huddled together like animals.
And one more, Your Honors. All right, if we can call that up later, I'll show that to you. I said in the best of conditions because in the worst, all too frequently, detainees were subjected to beatings, rape, terror, and death. For example, in early June, approximately 160 men were killed at the Karadžić Technical School in Zvornik. In July, in one night at Karaterm in Prijedor, approximately 150 men were killed. In August, approximately 200 men were killed who were being taken from the Ternopoli camp in Prijedor. Many of them had come from Omarska and Karaterm, taken supposedly to be exchanged. In September, approximately 140 men from the Susica camp in Vlasenica were killed. The Bosnian Serb leadership had been denying the existence of camps since May. But by July, there was increasing media focus on camps and increasing international attention. At the beginning of August, or end of July or beginning of August, reporters confronted Radovan Karadžić with his repeated assurances about the camps and extracted from him a promise that they could visit the Omarska camp and the Ternopoli camp in Prijedor. Now, when they got there, they were kept from the worst parts of the camp, and officials tried to put their best foot forward by presenting detainees with a meal they'd never seen before. But nevertheless, the resulting images obtained shocked the world. Many of those you see, Your Honor, were people who had just come from the Karaterm and Ternopily camps, those detainees in the Ternopily facility in the worst conditions. Now, following the outcry in the wake of such videos, many of these prisoners from Omarska, Karaterm, camps in Sanski Most, et cetera, were sent to the VRS camp Manjača in Banja Luka. They had been providing prisoners from those municipalities to Banja Luka previously, and many of those from Omarska and Karaterm were then sent to Manjača by the Bosnian Serb leadership. I want to read you a list of the condition of some of the people who were held in Manjača on August 20th. You'll have a chance to see this document. And just a few of the references, I think, make the point. This describes the condition of some of these prisoners. Spinal fracture, heart disease, that's one of the prisoners. Disabled, one hand. Active pulmonary tuberculosis. Diabetes, cannot stand up. Operation of large intestine, has no control of bowel movement. Another, cannot walk easily. Another, does not hear well and without one kidney. Another, retarded, repeats himself. Another, mentally ill, epilepsy. Another, deaf, has no control of bowel movement, and so on. In addition, there were boys under the age of 18 and elderly men. Now, these were the people that Karadžić in interviews repeatedly called prisoners of war. How did such people end up as prisoners, and what was supposed to happen to them? And I'd like to turn to that now, because the answer, in significant part, is reflected in the cleansing operations that I told you about before, but is also reflected in the document I'm about to show you. Quote, the Army, crisis staffs, and war presidencies have requested that the Army round up or capture as many Muslim civilians as possible, and they leave such undefined camps to internal affairs organs. The conditions in some of these camps are poor. There is no food. Individuals sometimes do not observe international norms, etc. This is a report by the Minister of Interior addressed personally, directly, to Karadžić on July 17th, 1992. And it's noteworthy that it's not a report of alarm about a massive crime. It's simply a matter-of-fact explanation about some of the competing responsibilities that the MUP are required to engage in that keep them from their more conventional tasks. The wholesale roundup and confinement of Muslims, in fact, was no secret, nor could it be. As a deputy noted at the Assembly in July, quote, we have a huge problem with captured people of other nationalities. We have hundreds and thousands of these prisoners. Karadžić was present at that Assembly session. Krajisnik was present at that Assembly session. The Bosnian Serb leadership was there. And the roundup of civilians is also reflected in documents from the camps themselves. Here's a report from Manjača on the 23rd of July, 1992, noting that they had processed almost 1,000 prisoners from Sanski Most that day, and there is no evidence that, quote, the great number of them, unquote, had anything to do with war operations. Quote, did not take part in combat activities, were not in possession of weapons, and there are no other evidence based on which they could be kept prisoners, unquote. As a Manjača official wrote on the 22nd of July, 1992, quote, this camp can be considered as a detention camp, that is, a camp for segregation of Muslims and Croats, which history will not forgive us, unquote. Now, these civilians, Your Honors, as observed in a report from the regional head of the police in Banja Luka, that's Stojan Župlanin, to the Minister of Interior, Micho Stanisic, were, quote, hostages, or could be, unquote, or could be treated as such. Jublin described 3 categories of prisoners that he was aware of. One category was members of Bosnian military formations. That basically included anybody who was a member of the regular TO. Persons who organized preparation for, quote, armed rebellion, unquote. That typically included anybody who was associated with the SDA. And 3, quote, the third category is composed of adult men about whom the service does not have any information of security interest for us so far. Therefore, they can be treated as hostages, unquote. The ultimate solution, as Juplanin went on to suggest in his report, would be to exchange the prisoners, that is, send them to Muslim-held areas in exchange for Serbs held by Muslims. And in that way, the separation process which had begun with the forcible removal of Bosnian Muslims and Croats with their wholesale roundup could be completed as they were transported out of Republika Srpska. And Your Honors, given the time when we return, I'd like to discuss with you that exchange system.
Thank you, Mr. Tigo. We'll have a break of 25 minutes.
All rise. Forgive le vin.